Now, the C-SPAN series Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, visits the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa, and explores the career of our 31st president.
On April 7, 1927, the telephone was 51 years old. In a New York auditorium, a handful of people were given a glimpse of the future. It was called television. The show, if you could call it that, originated in Washington, D.C. and starred Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce. This first crude transmission was the work of engineers from Bell Laboratories. They had invented the transmission system not for the sake of entertainment, but to learn more about long-distance networks. At the time, few people realized just how successful the experiment would turn out to be.
What you're looking at on your screen is 80 years old, the first ever live television transmission, conducted in 1927 and starring the then Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover. Right there on your television screen is a live picture from the Herbert Hoover Library and Museum of the first television camera, the type you just saw in the opening video. We're going to take you there this evening to explore the political career of our nation's 31st president through that library's archival collections as we begin our 12-part series, Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered. Here in our studios in Washington this evening, Richard Norton Smith, who will be joining us every week on this 12-part series. Tell us about the series and why we're doing it.
Oh boy. Well, here we are on the eve of a presidential election, and I think lots of voters of all persuasions and ideologies feel that the presidency has become wrapped up in a cocoon, that it's all political theater, both running for president and being president. And they want more than anything else to see the authentic, good, bad, and different. And with that in mind, we went out to all 12 presidential libraries and dug up more than 1,000 pieces of film, audio, video, which in fact are exactly that. This is fly-on-the-wall history.
Who was Herbert Hoover?
Herbert Hoover was the 31st president of the United States, a man whose life is both a great American triumph and, to most people, perhaps a great American tragedy.
And what's the relevance of the material we're going to be able to see from the Hoover Library?
Well, among other things, one of the themes of this series is presidents are judged, for better or worse, by how they handle the mass media. Harry Truman famously said that the chief job of a modern president is persuasion. And the instruments of persuasion today are television, the internet, once were radio, and before that, the newspapers. And one of the themes of this broadcast and the whole series, you'll see Hoover, ironically, the first person to appear on television who doesn't really know what to make of it or the other instruments of mass communications available to him as president.
Tim Walsh, who is the current director of the Herbert Hoover Library, is on your screen in just a second here. He's been out there at that library for 19 years, worked with Richard Norton Smith in those days, and will be with us all evening long to give us some background on where this is, what's inside it. And this is really not so much about the libraries in this series as much about the archival material. Tim Walsh, tell us, where are you standing at the moment in the library?
Well, Brian, it's good to be with you and Richard again. It's like old home week. Welcome to West Branch. But we're standing in a food warehouse, a Belgian food warehouse, circa 1914, which is really the beginning of Herbert Hoover's public life. He was a mining engineer in London. He was asked to feed the starving children of Belgium and northern France. And as he said, that was the beginning of his time on the slippery slope of public life. So this is the public part of the institution. We show our flour sacks and many other wonderful things. But for most of the broadcast tonight, we're going to go to the archival storage areas and the memorabilia storage areas to see extraordinary items that the public generally doesn't get a chance to see. We're going to see some documents and artifacts up close and personal. And I'm going to leave this public area and go through a door, and we'll show you that area. And we're going to start with a film clip, I believe, a video film clip of our cold storage area. Folks don't understand that we keep our films in the deep freeze until they have to be used. This will prevent deterioration and degradation over the years. And our audiovisual archivist, Lynn Smith, will be showing you that film storage area, which is a special part of the building, again, that the public doesn't see. So I invite everyone to come along with me to the back part of the Hoover Presidential Library.
Tim, who does get to see this part?
Only special visitors like you, Brian, and others who get a chance to well, ask for a special tour. We at times provide tours like this to VIPs, and we consider all of the viewers of C-SPAN VIPs.
And so down that hallway is tucked all kinds of vaults and things?
Absolutely. This is the work area that folks are looking at. You can see storage cases. It's not clean or pretty particularly, but it's where the hard work gets done of preserving and protecting history. And as we go into the stacks in the reading room, we'll be showing you the fruits of that storage, what we keep there in special places.
Tim Walsh will join us from the reading room in just a few minutes, but first, Richard, tell us about this little package clip that you've got that's 7 minutes and 13 seconds that you've been involved in. What are we going to see?
Well, this is, again, Hoover the communicator. This is a man whose name is synonymous with all things modern, including television and a number of other innovations as Secretary of Commerce. And by 1928, the man who fed Belgium, the man who took care of the Mississippi flood relief effort in 1927, is seen as an all but inevitable choice for president.
Let's watch.
Herbert Hoover, do solemnly swear that you will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and, to the best of your ability, that you will preserve, maintain, and defend the Constitution of the United States. I do. I have no fears for the future of our country. It is bright with hope. And in the presence of my countrymen, mindful of the solemnity of this occasion, knowing what the task means and the responsibility which it involves, I beg of your tolerance, your aid, and your cooperation.
In 1928, Herbert Hoover was the celebrity candidate. He impressed the electorate as a non-politician, the classic outsider, someone who made his countrymen feel good about themselves, about their country, and about the political process. And in the 1920s, he was much more than just Secretary of Commerce under Calvin Coolidge. He really was seen as a kind of assistant president. He was arguably the most famous man in the land, but only so many people had actually seen him. So they filled that gap with films like Master of Emergencies, and then you had to deliver it to the voting public. And one of the ways they did it.
Now, the C-SPAN series Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered. Now, the C-SPAN series Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, visits the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa, and explores the career of our 31st president.
On April 7, 1927, the telephone was 51 years old. In a New York auditorium, a handful of people were given a glimpse of the future. It was called television. The show, if you could call it that, originated in Washington, D.C. and starred Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce. This first crude transmission was the work of engineers from Bell Laboratories. They had invented the transmission system not for the sake of entertainment, but to learn more about long-distance networks. At the time, few people realized just how successful the experiment would turn out to be.
What you're looking at on your screen is 80 years old, the first ever live television transmission, conducted in 1927 and starring the then Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover. Right there on your television screen is a live picture from the Herbert Hoover Library and Museum of the first television camera, the type you just saw in the opening video. We're going to take you there this evening to explore the political career of our nation's 31st president through that library's archival collections as we begin our 12-part series, Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered. Here in our studios in Washington this evening, Richard Norton Smith, who will be joining us every week on this 12-part series. Tell us about the series and why we're doing it.
Oh boy. Well, here we are on the eve of a presidential election, and I think lots of voters of all persuasions and ideologies feel that the presidency has become wrapped up in a cocoon, that it's all political theater, both running for president and being president. And they want more than anything else to see the authentic, good, bad, and different. And with that in mind, we went out to all 12 presidential libraries and dug up more than 1,000 pieces of film, audio, video, which in fact are exactly that. This is fly-on-the-wall history.
Who was Herbert Hoover?
Herbert Hoover was the 31st president of the United States, a man whose life is both a great American triumph and, to most people, perhaps a great American tragedy.
And what's the relevance of the material we're going to be able to see from the Hoover Library?
How they handle the mass media. Harry Truman famously said that the chief job. So you have someone who has been sold. He even feared oversold. Yet he was complicit in that sales campaign. He had, at the very least, allowed his promoters to exploit his very real, heroic achievements. His inauguration was seen by millions of Americans in a way that had never been before, thanks to the presence of the talkies, for whom this was, in fact, the first presidential swearing-in to be broadcast. The ceremony was actually delayed for half an hour or so. The country didn't have a president, technically, because Mrs. Hoover and Mrs. Coolidge got lost in the bowels of the Capitol. What made Herbert Hoover president was the idea demonstrated in his own life that the American people were the most generous people in the world. He had marshaled their generosity to feed millions in Europe and at home. Ironically, it was this very idea that came to haunt him after Wall Street collapsed just 7 months into his presidency. His image overnight went from that of Superman to scapegoat. In 1932, accepting his party's renomination, few could disagree with his analysis. Many disagreed with his response.
The past 3 years have been a time of unparalleled economic calamity. They have been years of greater suffering and hardship than any which have come to the American people since the aftermath of the Civil War.
C-SPAN's special series on the Presidential Library's archives, Presidential History Uncovered, continues. You're looking at a live picture from the reading room of the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa. Tim Walsh is the director. Tim, where is West Branch? How can you direct people to this library?
Well, we were blessed to be located right on Interstate 80, Brian. We're 10 miles east of Iowa City, where tomorrow the University of Iowa Hawkeyes will soundly defeat the Syracuse Orangemen.
And what room is this you're standing in?
We're standing in the reading room here at the Hoover Presidential Library Museum. And of course, if you look at the walls around me, you'll see books and you'll see card catalogs, and so people would logically think this is a library in the conventional sense of the term. We're called a presidential library because Franklin Roosevelt, who built the first presidential library, thought the term archives was too antiquated, that people wouldn't know what the term meant. So we called his building to store his documents and memorabilia a presidential library, and all of the institutions established since, from Harry Truman on, have been called presidential libraries. So we're in the reading room where scholars do research and who basically write the books from which history is made.
What are some of the things you can show us in that room that might be of interest?
Well, we have, in addition to what you can see on the walls, we have on these tables an assortment of some of the documents and items that we'll be talking about later tonight as we go through the program. We have some campaign memorabilia. For example, we have this wonderful little poster, "This home is for Hoover." These were cards that were put in windows so that whole families could declare their loyalty to President Hoover. This is from the campaign of 1928. We've got other items from the campaign of 1932. Other items here, the friendship and later the rivalry between Herbert Hoover and Franklin D. Roosevelt. The two men are pictured here. And then next to it, we have an extraordinary stack. We'll be talking about these things, of correspondence between Herbert Hoover and Harry S. Truman. It was an extraordinary friendship between a Republican and a Democrat that harkens back to the days of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and forecasts forward to the friendship between George H.W. Bush and President Bill Clinton.
I understand you
Next
have
to it,
Tim, I understand you have the 1929 inaugural speech of Herbert
We
Hoover.
sure do. We sure do. Right over here on the podium, we have the inaugural speech that Herbert Hoover delivered, the actual reading copy from that speech. And let me just read one paragraph from it because it shows the hopes and dreams that Herbert Hoover had for the nation. "It is impossible, my countrymen, to speak of peace without profound emotion. In thousands of homes in America, in millions of homes around the world, there are vacant chairs. It would be a shameful confession of our unworthiness if it should develop that we have abandoned the hope for which all these men died." He's referring to World War I, of course. "Surely civilization is old enough, surely mankind is mature enough, so that we ought in our own lifetime to find a way to permanent peace." The document heralds his hopes for America, and of course, as we know, it would be 4 more difficult years. So this is the first document we're showing, and we're going to take you back into the stacks now, and I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Matt Schaefer, an archivist here at the Hoover Presidential Library Museum. Matt is sort of master of the stacks, and he's the one who serves our researchers. So we'll turn it over to Matt Schaefer.
Well, thank you, Tim. If I'm master of the stacks, you must be master of the universe. We are leaving the public area here, the Hoover Library. I'm going to take you back into the stacks, a place that's generally accessible only to staff and to special visitors, as Tim says, the C-SPAN audience.
Matt Schaefer, how long have you been there?
I've been at the Hoover Library for 5 years, 5 months,
Where'd you
and 5
come?
days.
Where'd you come from?
I came from Cleveland originally, but I've been in Iowa City for 15 years, so I'm pretty near a native in Iowa. We are now entering the stacks area. I'm sorry, I got a little bit ahead of Bill there. This is the center of the archival universe for the Hoover Library. This is where we keep all of the stuff. It's the part of the building that's built first when you build an archives. I want to stop. Richard, you mentioned Hoover building speeches like he would build a bridge or develop a mine. I had a speech here that called that to mind.
There's a disconnect between his lips and the...
Okay. It's actually not a speech, it's a piece that Hoover wrote addressing Roosevelt's foreign policy in 1939. He wrote it for Liberty Magazine. It's a 22-page, 22 typescript pages, about 8 pages of a magazine article talking about American foreign policy in early 1939.
Is that the original
Hoover thinks
copy?
this is what's called the Bible. Hoover and his staff kept all of his addresses, articles, and public statements, literally numbered from 1 to 8,000. We have 97 volumes of the Bible. And this is the last typescript copy. So it's the clean copy. It's like the record copy for Hoover and his staff.
When somebody comes to visit there, they don't actually get their hands on that if they're doing research, or do they?
Absolutely they do. I mean, we're about providing access to Hoover's stuff. Absolutely.
So they don't, okay.
If somebody came to the Hoover Library and said, I'd like to look at what he wrote in 1939, what's the best way to do that? I would say, you want to look at the Bible. And I'll bring out 4 or 5 of these volumes. This volume, I think, covers the period from January to May, 1939. So probably 3 volumes would cover all of 1939. And if a researcher said, well, you know, that's interesting, but there must be more to this. How do you write a 22-page speech in the final copy? I want to see how his thoughts developed. I would say, well, we have what's called the Bible background files. And literally, we have hundreds of these boxes where we can actually see Hoover's mind at work. This whole box is actually that Liberty Magazine article. I'm going to take a couple of folders out just by way of demonstration here. Bear with me so I don't drop the box. And you can see, literally, from the gestation of the idea, Herbert Hoover's handwriting as he goes through draft after draft after draft of this article. And, you know, I'm happy to serve this as well. You know, this for me is exciting. When somebody says, I want to know how Hoover developed that thought, how Hoover developed that idea, I'm more than happy to serve this up. That's what we're about. And you can see this is actually kind of cute. This is a very typical Hoover technique. When he got close to the end, close to the final version of his draft, he would start cutting and pasting and pinning little things together. And you can see editing, editing, editing. You know, Hoover was never really what I would call a gifted writer, but boy, he was diligent. He would draft these things 15.
Hate to interrupt, we've got so much to show folks. Why don't you move on, if you would, to another section of the stacks?
Okay, as we walk into the stacks here, you can see the stacks range east wall, west wall. We can see literally thousands of boxes. We have 12,000 boxes here in the Hoover Library stacks. About a third of them are Hoover material. We're panning down now Hoover's Commerce papers, and as he pans to the back to the west wall, it goes Commerce, Campaign and Transition, Presidential papers, Presidential papers, Presidential papers, and then Post-Presidential wrapping around, filling about a third of the west range of the stacks here. The rest of the stacks on the first floor here are made up or comprised of collections related to Hoover. His wife's papers are here, people who worked with him, people who served in his cabinet, for instance, Lewis Strauss, who was a friend and colleague. Literally 300 collections, 298 of them not named Hoover. In the stacks here, you can't see, I don't know if Bill can shoot up here. You can see we have a wet pipe system in case there's any sort of, God forbid, fire or heat in the stacks. We have sensors every 8 feet, sprinkler heads every 8 feet, so that if something like that should happen, the fire suppression system would kick in and the damage would be contained.
Could you show us the Rapidan letter?
System. I do. I want to show the Rapidan letter. On the card here, we have a letter from Mrs. Hoover to her son Alan. Mrs. Hoover is at Camp Rapidan, which is the President's Camp. It is the predecessor of Camp David, and she spent the whole month of July there, and she writes Alan Hoover sometime in that month. I've in my 3rd week of camp, and I've been camping, I've been riding, I've been fishing, I've had a wonderful time. I think it's good for your daddy that I'm away, because when I'm away, he doesn't have to spend his time entertaining the ladies after dinner.
Matt Schaefer,
she closes the letter.
Go ahead.
She closes the letter with a little, I don't know, a little admonition I think mothers are famous for the year all around the world. She says, it took me exactly 6 minutes to write this. You take 5 minutes twice each week, and I don't get half as much in the way of news.
Thanks, Matt Schaefer. We'll be back to you. Richard Norton Smith, we've got another segment that you pre-produced. What is it?
This is, I believe, the Camp Rapidan segment. Herbert Hoover loved the outdoors. He was an environmentalist long before the term became popular. And he took about $100,000 of his own money once he became president, and he built a fishing camp about 100 miles from Washington. Very few people know about it. As such, it's a metaphor for the Hoover presidency. We went out there last October on a spectacular autumn day, and here's what we found.
This is about 11 minutes long.
That's right.
I never saw him happier than when he was on the Rapidan. He could hardly wait to leave the car. He would go put on his rubber boots and hurry out to fish, seldom taking time to change from whatever he'd been wearing, often a suit, high white collar and tie. Joel T. Boone, Herbert Hoover's personal physician.
I think this place is a metaphor for Hoover. Certainly it's a metaphor for the unknown Hoover. Much of Hoover's fight against the Great Depression, what he called a war on 1,000 fronts, was fought in this very building. He would bring out to Rapidan members of his cabinet, unofficial advisors, economists, Supreme Court justices, always looking for a new idea, and usually being disappointed. One of Hoover's crippling flaws as a leader was his inability to communicate and bond with the American people. He had radio and talking newsreels at his disposal, but if Americans saw any images from Camp Rapidan, they were of Hoover fishing and relaxing, not of a compassionate man working around the clock in an effort to relieve their suffering. You don't need much imagination. You just need to listen to the sounds of that place. Herbert Hoover is a man who found God in a trout stream before a church pew. Rapidan today is little known. It was actually little known and little understood while he was there. There were some people then who actually complained, why is the president off fishing while Rome is burning? Rapidan was not an escape. It was a different environment. He thought a more creative environment in which to deal with the problems that had engulfed his presidency. I think he's a tragic president. There are lots of presidents who don't realize their potential. There are some who fail abysmally. They're not tragic because they don't have the dimensions of Greek tragedy. When you look at Hoover here at Rapidan, you look at the old footage, what do you see and what don't you see? On the one hand, you obviously see a man who is glad to be out of Washington, a man who is very much at home in this setting. You don't see, by and large, the anguish that lay behind that. You see a man in a coat and tie in a stream looking for trout. You don't see the man sitting on the porch in endless conferences looking for something much more elusive, which was a solution or even a new idea. Along about Friday morning, according to Mrs. Hoover, the president was chomping at the bit to get in a car and drive out. Lou was famous for driving faster than the Secret Service agents could keep up with him. There were something like a dozen other buildings that surrounded what they called the Brown House, which was a gentle bit of mockery on the White House. There was also Town Hall, which was a kind of gathering place where people could come and do nothing. They could sit on the porch and read or do picture puzzles, and in the evening there might be discussions, and always good conversation. The British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald visited Washington during the Hoover presidency, and it is alleged that MacDonald said, well, he didn't have the clothes, to wear to a fishing camp, and the president said, don't worry, we can take care of that. So the story goes, they sat around the fish pond and discussed a subject very close to both men's hearts, disarmament, which turned out to be one more of the disappointments that defined the Hoover presidency. Hoover built the camp with the idea that when he left Washington, whenever that was, he would donate it to the United States and that it would be available for his successors. As it turned out, of course, Franklin Roosevelt, a man in a wheelchair, found the terrain surrounding the camp to be very difficult. But I also think he probably wanted, for political reasons, to have as little to do with the Hoover legacy, even if it was a gift in the form of the camp. Rapidan gave rise to what FDR called Shangri-La in the Maryland mountains, and Dwight Eisenhower renamed in honor of his grandson, Camp David. Camp Rapidan, in many ways, was the culmination of a lifelong love of the outdoors. Hoover, as a young mining engineer with Lou, had spent a lot of time in various fishing camps around the world. And that seems to have been at least what he had in mind. That's what led him in 1929 to actually put about $120,000 of his own money into this project. He said once that he had discovered that even the work of government could be made bearable by moving it outdoors under the trees. Before there was Eleanor Roosevelt, there was Lou Hoover, who in many ways was very much of an activist herself. And one of her gifts, in fact, was she was an amateur architect. This is a place that is very much in harmony with its physical setting. The fact is there are no foundations here. The fact is that this was built around existing trees. The relationship between Herbert and Lou Hoover is one of the more intriguing and less well-known aspects of this whole story, because they were, from the beginning, they were not only a partnership, they were equal partners. During his mining career days, they spent something like 4 years on ocean liners crisscrossing the globe. And they brought the children along. Lou designed a cradle exclusively for use on board ocean liners. After their honeymoon, they lived in China. They were caught up in the Boxer Rebellion. Lou used to get up every day and sweep the bullets off the front porch of their home in the Western Colony in Tientsin. And for the rest of their lives, and particularly in the White House, whenever they wanted to communicate in private, they would speak Chinese. When you look at those two bedrooms in the Brown House, it's a metaphor for a partnership that was at least temporarily put on hold. The work of the presidency literally came between them. Initially, the Hoovers shared this room, but not wanting to disturb Mrs. Hoover as he worked through the long days and even longer nights, the president built himself a separate bedroom. The Hoovers arrived here late one Friday afternoon, and in this room, the next day, the president spent 12 hours on an open phone to Chicago in a desperate attempt to keep the biggest bank in that city from going under. If you'd been in the living room with the president, I think you would find a man of enormous coiled energy, someone probably torn between a burning desire to go out and fish and a burdensome weight of justifying that day, like every day, by finding some idea that might help people to prevent foreclosures on their homes, or keep their banks from crashing, or shorten the unemployment lines. It was a terrible weight that he carried every time he went to Rapidan. It was like trying to climb a mountain in the middle of an avalanche. People who don't know Hoover, and that's most people, but that also included most of his contemporaries, they didn't know they had a marvelously dry sense of humor, particularly on the subject of children and fishing. He said memorably that fishing was a great lesson in democracy, for all men are created equal before fishes. Coming to this place, it wasn't only escaping from the hothouse of the White House in a very bleak and depressing time. In some ways, it was almost a return to his childhood. I think fishing conjured up Iowa in the 1870s and 80s. After his presidency, he only comes back here once. I think probably there are a number of reasons for that. I think it probably had a lot of memories, a lot of ghosts. It wasn't a particularly happy chapter in his life, although he was happy when he was here. And I also suspect that after Mrs. Hoover died in 1944, it would have been almost a painful experience for him to come back here. To the extent that they had happy times here, it was very much a shared experience with Lou. Hoover became calcified in popular memory as a failed president whose failure was measured by the distance between people's expectations and between the leadership he offered or failed to offer, particularly in combating the Great Depression. He understood his limitations, and part of the tragedy is, he said at one point, I only wish I could say what I feel in my heart. But he couldn't. His head prevailed over his heart. And because Hoover couldn't dramatize his compassion, something confirmed by virtually all the images from Camp Rapidan, Americans lost their belief in Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover wasn't easy to get to. Herbert Hoover's presidency isn't easy to get to, even now. When you come here, you discover that these are not the caricatures that we've all encountered in the textbooks. That these are much more interesting, much more warm-blooded, much more likable, much more vulnerable people than we thought we knew. And yet, no less remote. Remoteness, I think, defines this place, and in many ways defines them in their lifetimes and in their historical afterlife.
On your screen is the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, and Richard Norton Smith, whose voice you heard underneath that video, was the director there from 1987 to 1993. But he was succeeded by Tim Welch, who is on your screen now, and will tell us some more about something called the Ted Joslin Diaries.
Right. Thanks, Brian. Yes, and as Richard said in the film, it's so difficult to come to grips with the Hoover presidency to get the inside view of what the president was actually doing. And in my hand, I'm holding a very small but very important diary, that of Ted Joslin, the president's press secretary. I'm going to turn this around and let folks focus. No one except the rare researcher gets a chance to look at this, and I want everyone to see the tight, tiny little handwriting. I'm going to read two short passages from this diary, but I can't read it from his handwriting, so we've literally transcribed it to read to you. This is Sunday, January 3rd, 1932, that I'm going to read from, and then one other passage, but it's in this little diary form, and we have several volumes. It's a rather extraordinary diary. In these entries, Ted says, "If any living president knows presidents, it is Ike Hoover, who is serving his 41st year in the White House. Here is Ike's diagnosis of the president. Quote, he is the ablest, hardest working president of the lot, but he is too sincere, too serious, too sensitive. The three S's, so to speak. He takes everything on himself when he should delegate all but the most essential work." And one later passage from March 5th, 1932. "A question I am asked repeatedly is how the president carries on during the Depression. The answer is that he works, and the more serious conditions are, the harder he works. There are times, of course, when the problems weigh heavily upon him, times when the weight down inside he is discouraged, but with the exception of occasions that I can count on my fingers of one hand, he hasn't shown it even to those of us intimately associated with him." Ted Joslin gives us an insider's view, not only of the administration, but of the man himself. And one other document I wanted to talk about, something that seems fairly ordinary and nondescript, and this is the President's annual message, State of the Union message. This is for 1931, which is, of course, a bleak time in our record, but it's also at a time when the President articulates the problems. The documents behind me on that cart, those boxes, reflect how much work Mr. Hoover put into these speeches. And in this particular speech, kind of buried down, is the passage which talks about the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. In order that the public may be absolutely assured and that the government may be in a position to meet any public necessity, I recommend that an emergency reconstruction corporation of the nature of the former War Finance Corporation should be established. Hoover was an activist president in the manner of Teddy Roosevelt, and it's all documented in the boxes that we have here at the Hoover Library.
In a couple of minutes, we're going to take calls for those of you who would like to ask questions of the historians and archivists. The numbers are going to be on your screen. You can begin dialing now. I hope you could have either some insight that you might have had about Herbert Hoover or some good questions so that we can continue this discussion. We'll only spend about 15 minutes with phones, but before we do that, Matt Schaefer, who is with the Herbert Hoover Library, is about to take us back into the stacks and show us another part. Where are you going this time, Matt?
We're going to go upstairs to the cage area and to where we keep our scrapbooks.
What is the cage?
The cage is where we keep our intrinsically valuable documents, documents with signature value. If you know, Hoover obviously corresponded with a lot of important people: Truman, Eisenhower, MacArthur, and items like manuscripts, drafts, drafts in Hoover's own hand. We tend to put in the cage. Other things we have in the cage are Mrs. Hoover's. Well, I'll show you when we get there, I suppose I'll say. But before we get to the cage, I wanted to show a scrapbook of Rapidan, just to kind of close the book on Rapidan, so to speak. This is a scrapbook put together by Campbell Hodges, who was a military attaché charged with Hoover's security. He spent a lot of time with Hoover, kept a diary, not quite as rich as Jocelyn's, but a very interesting diary, sort of showing the working man's perspective at the side of the president. And he's also quite a good photographer.
Now,
Okay, I wanna get to the cage,
that is not kept in the cage, though.
No, this is not kept in the cage. It's not. The cage, you'll see, only contains about 60 linear feet of material. So we have to make appraisal decisions as to what we put in the cage. You're probably going to laugh at the lock, but rest assured, we're inside a box, inside a box, inside a box. This is the deepest part of the archival stacks, and we're talking about a place that is under 24/7 security. What I want to show from the cage is from Mrs. Lou Henry Hoover's papers. It is a letter from Mrs. Hoover in 1900 to her college classmate, Evelyn White, written literally a month after the siege of Tianjin, the Boxer Rebellion siege. And she writes, "Well, Evelyn White, you missed one of the opportunities of your life by not coming to China in the summer of 1900. And then she goes on to describe the siege of Tianjin, where she and Mr. Hoover literally came under fire for weeks at a time. Mrs. Hoover at this time is 25 years old, recent newlywed. This is her first trip overseas. This is the equivalent of somebody writing from Baghdad, 2 years ago. The green zone, that's where you want to be." She closes by saying,
What makes that so special that it has to be in the cage?
well, if you look at it, it's all Mrs. Hoover's handwriting, and it's just a singularly unique document in what it reveals about her spirit, about her adventure, about her sense of, wow, the world's an exciting place. And you'll see, I don't know if Bill can get this shot, we have literally 3 boxes of Mrs. Hoover stuff in the cage. Her diaries, which are now actually down in the reading room by Tim, but some of her letters to her father, letters to her sister. Why is it in the cage? It's just, it's essentially valuable. It's intrinsically valuable to the Hoover story. You can see boxes and boxes here, literally 20, 30, 60 boxes here in the cage. And I could open any of these boxes and we would find something interesting and valuable. There's another document I want to share from Mrs. Hoover's correspondence. This is a letter, again, to Evelyn White, where she writes to Evelyn after Evelyn has announced her engagement. And Mrs. Hoover is saying, "Well, really, this is wonderful. Urge him not to spoil you, Evelyn." And evidently Mrs. Hoover then left the letter on her writing desk, because then Mr. Hoover's handwriting is the next paragraph that follows, and it says, "It depends on what you mean, spoil you. Here's my advice to your husband-to-be. Don't letter a signature of your bank account. Don't swear off all bad habits. Instead, pick up one bad habit every 5 years or so and let her fix you of it so that she feels like she's having a proper moral influence." And then Mrs. Hoover, after Herbert has offered 4 or 5 suggestions to the husband-to-be, comes in and says, "Another nice thing about being married is that you always have someone around to finish up your letters." And this is a letter that actually Delia Rios picked up on when she was going through doing the research. And that's kind of typical in our business here. Often it's the researchers who find the gems for us. And she shared that with us, and I said, I'll find a way to get that into the program.
Delia Rios is working with C-SPAN as our history producer and is very much involved in the research, along with Eric Nelson, who went to all these libraries and did original research. We're going to go to the phones. Matt Schaefer, do you have anything else right now? Because we have a couple of phone calls.
I just wanted to, just by way of demonstration, I think I could pull any box out of the cage and literally almost any folder out of the cage and find something interesting. Douglas MacArthur, a name probably known to C-SPAN viewers. I'm going to pull that out for you, Bill. Let's see. It's a letter from Douglas MacArthur to President Hoover, 1937. Respectfully saying, I am not going to respond to your question at this time because I'm still Chief of Staff. Hoover and MacArthur had a long, long history going back to, back to the bonus march, and then it extended deep into the 1950s. But literally, you know, box after box of material, that's in the cage because obviously a type letter signed by General MacArthur has value. And we want to know when we're serving that, you know, just sort of as a reminder to the archivist, let's, you know, keep an eye on this. This is one we don't want to lose.
Thanks, Madam Chair. We'll see you downstairs in a moment, but we're going to go to the phones right now to New York City on the Democratic line. Good evening. You're on the air.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for C-SPAN. I'd just like to understand why there's such a disconnect between the reputation Hoover has as pretty much a laissez-faire, do-nothing president with his seeming desire to get us through the Depression.
Richard Norton Smith, what do you say?
Well, there is a disconnect, and there are a lot of reasons for that. First of all, Hoover was his own worst salesman. You've seen some of that already this evening. He invited, frankly, some of the criticism. There was an organized campaign of, we think we invented negative politics or negative advertising. In fact, the Democratic National Committee did a brilliant job of personalizing the Great Depression. Time magazine called him President Reject. We've all heard about Hoovervilles, shanty towns of homeless people. There were Hoover flags, which were empty pockets turned inside out. Remember, the mass media were just really coming into their own, and there was a tendency to personalize events. And Hoover, who was a rather dour figure without charisma, who was a brilliant administrator in many ways, but the job changed. You know, it became a job about empathy, about communicating one's compassion, and that was something that he, of all people, really wasn't very good at.
You're watching a special series of 12 parts that will go over 12 weeks of the different archival material at the presidential libraries. Our aim, our objective was to go behind the scenes. This is not meant to be a complete picture of a president, and we have this website also set up with 1,000 different items on it. You can find it by going to cspan.org, and right there in the upper right-hand corner where it's advertising the Presidential Library Series, click on that and you can get into this resource, and it'll be here for a very long time for you to pass on to your friends and those interested in presidential history. Round Rock, Texas, on the GOP line, you're on the air.
My name is Mary. I'm calling from Round Rock, Texas. I was wondering if you have any memorabilia referring to the courtship of Mr. Hoover and his wife, or anything about the relationship, how they ended up in China.
Tim Walsh, what do you say to that?
Well, yeah, yes, we do, although it tends to be fairly modest in nature because the Hoovers, particularly Herbert Hoover, was not particularly very romantic. We would love to find, we don't think it exists, but we would love to find the telegram that Mr. Hoover sent to Mrs. Hoover proposing marriage from Australia. They were both students at Stanford University. In fact, two students from Iowa were put together as lab partners in the geology program and kind of got to know one another and fell in love. They had migrated separately to California, and Mr. Hoover goes off after graduation. Mrs. Hoover's still a student at Stanford. He gets a job in Western Australia, and they continue to correspond. And so often is the case with Victorian marriages, it led to love, and he proposed by telegram, and then came back to the United States to get married. It was a very simple service in her parents' living room. They actually were married in their traveling clothes because his next job assignment was in China, and so off they went. So we have some of the documents related to the time in China, their early years of marriage that Matt referred to, and the correspondence. And then we also have here, just to show you, evidence of a diary. We have some of Mrs. Hoover's diaries, and again you can see the tiny, tiny little handwriting. But it's a bird's eye view of not only life during the Boxer Rebellion, but the life of a newlywed. So it was a very touching, personal marriage. They were very much helpmates, people who deeply loved one another, but also very private people. And so there isn't a lot of clothing or other types of memorabilia from the marriage itself.
We're going to take calls for another 10 minutes, and we'll have another segment in our next hour, but let's go to Vienna, Virginia next on the Democratic line. Good evening. Vienna, you're on the air. Go ahead, please. Hello, Vienna.
Yes.
Go right ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yes, my question is, I noticed that I have been to West Branch and have gone through the library there, as I've been to all 12 of the presidential libraries. And my question is this, what differentiates what is kept at West Branch and what I understand they do have some of his documents at the Stanford University?
Matt Schaefer, can you handle that one?
I can take that, sure, Brian. Hoover created his collection originally to be housed at Stanford, at the Hoover Institution. That was his baby. He created it right after World War I as a way to document change in 20th century America and Europe. As time went on, Hoover and Stanford kind of drifted apart philosophically, and Hoover, looking at the development of presidential libraries, especially that of his close friend Harry Truman, said, you know, presidential library is a good idea. The people of West Branch have been good to me. I have a museum underway there. I think I should take part of my collection, part of my personal papers, out of the Hoover Institution in Stanford and create a presidential library like Truman, like Roosevelt, like Eisenhower, and set it up in West Branch. So the demarcation was basically he wanted to do everything from his commerce years forward. Well, it's hard to separate when you're talking about thousands and thousands of boxes, to have a clean split like that. So we have some pre-commerce materials, but by and large, everything after 1920 is here. Everything before 1920 for Hoover's career turned to Stanford, turned to Hoover Institution.
I understand our next call is from Urbana, Ohio, and former Representative Clarence Bud Brown. Mr. Brown, are you there?
I am here.
Why are you calling us?
Because my father was the author of the legislation that created the Hoover Commission, and I'm interested in the relationship between Truman and Hoover because my dad suggested to Truman that Hoover head up that commission. Truman was very unpopular at the time, and in 1946, and he seemed to think that would be a good idea, and it also tended to rehabilitate Herbert Hoover in the public mind because it was a commission to reorganize the government after World War II.
When did your father serve in Congress?
He served from 1939 to 1965.
And you served what years?
1965 to 1982.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Smith, you want to add anything to that?
Well, yeah, we'll get into the whole Hoover-Truman relationship later on, but Harry Truman's a very interesting guy. I mean, he certainly was a loyal Democrat, but he also agreed with Herbert Hoover that the federal government had exploded in size and function as a result of both of the Great Depression and World War II. And so by 1946, 1947, there was a bipartisan consensus that maybe we needed to take a fresh look and see if we could prune some of these functions back.
Jacksonville, Florida, go ahead, please.
Brian, thank you for C-SPAN. Two-part question. One is, why do you serve the original documents to the researchers as opposed to copies? And two, is there any way to purchase some of this material, or is it online or available in CD format?
Tim Walsh.
Well, we serve originals, of course, because we have quite literally millions of documents. In addition to about 4 million pages for Herbert Hoover, we also have another 4 million pages for about 300 other individuals, as I think Matt mentioned. And so to make all of those photocopies just to serve with not any certainty as to who would use them would be very expensive, and we're a government-supported institution. We trust our researchers, and we find, quite frankly, that they're very careful in how they use the papers. They wash their hands before they use them. And in most cases, we've processed the collections carefully and reinforced paper if necessary, and it seems to be good stewardship. The answer to your question is, can you purchase them? There's no question you can. If you go to our website, you can identify, for example, folders of items in our collection. And you can contact the archivist here, Matt, or his colleagues, and you can order documents for 75 cents per page. If you come here, you can copy them yourself for 20 cents a page. So we're eager to work with any researcher interested in any particular topic, and so we'd be happy to work with you. There are some digitized documents on our website. We're putting them up every day. It quite literally costs about $17 per document, I'm told, to digitize, mount, and maintain a document on websites. So it can be expensive. There's also something coming up called the Presidential Timeline that's sponsored by all 12 presidential libraries. So look for that on our presidential library sites to provide further documents. There's just a wonderful assortment of documents on all the presidential websites.
Chicago Heights, Illinois. Good evening.
Oh, good evening. I have one simple question. It's with all the documents there's probably at least one or two documents that are extremely valuable. Could you tell us about them?
Matt Schaefer?
I was anticipating this question, and for me, the value of any document is determined by does it answer the question in front of me. I mean, we certainly have intrinsically valuable documents. Some of them are on display out front. The inaugural address, it's one of a kind. The reading copy, there's no replacement. Many of Hoover's addresses that way. But you know, for me, it's does the document answer the researcher's question, or does it answer my question? That's the most valuable document in my estimation.
Okay.
I am fundamentally unable to think of these as having cash value.
Couple more minutes of calls. Arlington Heights, Illinois. Good evening.
Hi, my name is John. I visited the West Branch location there. I thought it was pretty neat. What my question was is the Federal Reserve System was set up before Hoover was in office, and I wonder when the Depression came, why he didn't or couldn't make more use of that. Since the SEC didn't start until after Roosevelt got in.
Thanks. Richard Smith.
Well, that's true. The Federal Reserve System was created really under Woodrow Wilson, who was one of actually Hoover's heroes. And, you know, people are still debating the causes of the Great Depression, including a school of thought that the Federal Reserve had more to do than anyone else with making a bad recession into a Great Depression. But presidential control over the Federal Reserve then as now was pretty limited.
Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Good evening. Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Are you there?
Yes,
try
hello.
that. Hi.
This is Eddie from Fort Lauderdale. It's my understanding that Herbert Hoover was a millionaire before becoming president, and I'd like to know how he amassed that fortune, and was he affected by the stock market crash, and what records do you have?
Tim Walsh.
In fact, the two areas where we have virtually no documentation, and that would be Mr. Hoover's wealth, that is his net worth, although he gave away, by the way, his salaries for any public office that he held, so as President or Secretary of Commerce. But we do not know what his net worth was, nor do we have any health records. So unlike today, where presidents are expected to release their tax returns and to tell us annually how their health is, we just don't have that information. Keep in mind that the papers and documents we have here of Mr. Hoover's were donated by him. These were his personal papers, his personal property, and so they were free to decide what to keep and what to donate, and we just don't have an answer to that question. It is certain that he was a prosperous man, most likely a multimillionaire. He gave away large sums of money, but certainly kept the records to himself as to how much money he shared and how much money he earned, primarily from mining properties around the world. Mine investments, essentially, was the principal way that he earned his money.
Mr. Smith, want to add something?
Well, at the beginning of World War I, he was 40 years old at the peak of his mining career. And the best estimates are he was worth about $4 million. And the best estimates that I could find is that his fortune during the presidency was cut roughly in half.
Humboldt, Iowa. This and one more call. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I grew up in Iowa, still living in Iowa, and there's lots of Herbert Hoover schools around the state, and I went to Hoover Elementary School in Mason City, Iowa, and it just seems funny that we never learned. I mean, going to a Herbert Hoover Elementary School, we never learned anything. I mean, I didn't even know who the guy was when I was in elementary school, and I just think it's kind of ironic that here I'm going to a school named after a president that we never here in Iowa learned about. And also, I was curious of how President Hoover ended his life, what he did towards the end of his life, and what kind of legacy he wanted to leave.
Thanks.
Well, it is kind of ironic. I did a lot of studying I was a historian before I was an archivist, and Hoover got the short shrift. You know, you get a paragraph of Hoover, it's always Hoover caused the Great Depression. Hoover is the president who did nothing during the Great Depression. It wasn't until I started working here that I had a much fuller picture of Hoover's life and, you know, the large accomplishments worldwide. It's a function of you know, curriculum and what they fit in and what they leave out.
Quick comment, Tim Walsh.
He ended his life. He died at 90, a full life. Outlived his wife by 20 years. outlived most of his friends.
Quick call, Tim Walsh. A quick comment on this.
60 different Herbert Hoover schools, including the one in Mason City that our caller mentioned, which was dedicated in 1954 on Herbert Hoover's 80th birthday. As many historians say, Herbert Hoover is a political orphan, to some extent abandoned by both parties, and what a crying shame. We work hard every day with our education programs here, at least to give Mr. Hoover a fair shake.
And he said the greatest honor that can come to an American is to have a school named after him.
Burke, Virginia. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yeah, good evening, gentlemen. I had a question about the 32 re-election campaign. Is it true that one of the arguments he made for his own re-election was that the hobos were eating better this year than last year?
Mr. Smith?
No, I don't think, he didn't say that, but there are comments that have been attributed to him that some thought, he said at one point, he did say, that no one was actually starving, which was, at the very least, a monumentally insensitive and certainly impolitic thing to say.
Last call, Des Moines, Iowa. You're on the air. Hello, Des Moines. Are you there?
Yes, thank you. My name is Clifton Spangler, and I have a question about when Hoover was head of the Supreme Economic Council, and I wanted to ask the people from West Branch if they have any documents pertaining to when he helped get shipments for food to starving Russians in 1921.
Thanks. Tim Walsh.
Yes, in fact, we have one of the items that they're going to see in the second hour of the show is a beautiful engrossed certificate from the people of the Soviet Union acknowledging Hoover's contributions to the Russian people in the famines of 1919 to 1923. So yes, in fact, when we get Russian visitors here, it's kind of interesting. They've never heard of Herbert Hoover, but they've heard of ARA. ARA saved Russia, and we finally figured out ARA is A-R-A, meaning American Relief Administration, which of course was led by Herbert Hoover.
Matt Schaefer, thank you for joining us and taking us through the stacks this evening. We hope to see you again soon.
You're welcome.
We're going to take a break and be right back with another hour on the Herbert Hoover Library and Archives.
You're watching C-SPAN's Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, a unique look at 12 of America's modern presidents, using rarely seen film and video, revealing a new perspective of these men. Tonight's program will continue in a moment, and you can watch this program in its entirety later here on C-SPAN at 11 p.m. Eastern, and hear more about tonight's president with additional audio recordings and interviews with noted historians. Tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio, XM Satellite Radio Channel 132. And for more historic footage and other exclusive materials, go online to our special website at cspan.org/presidential libraries.
And more of our series, Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered. Next Friday, we'll be live from the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park, New York, to examine the presidency of the man who led the U.S. through the Great Depression and World War II. During the 2-hour program, we'll look at the leadership style of our nation's 32nd president through rare film and sound recordings, as well as letters, documents, and artifacts collected from the stacks and vaults of the library. The Franklin Roosevelt Library and Museum, next Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern.
Next week on the C-SPAN networks, with General David Petraeus scheduled to deliver his report on Iraq, he and U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, Ryan Crocker, will testify live on Capitol Hill. Monday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern, they're before a joint House Armed Services and Foreign Affairs Committee hearing. Tuesday, first at 9:30 a.m. before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and following that at 2 before the Senate Armed Services Committee. Catch the hearings live on the C-SPAN networks, C-SPAN 3, cspan.org, and C-SPAN Radio. We'll show the hearings again each night starting at 10 Eastern on C-SPAN 2. General David Petraeus and U.S. Ambassador Ryan Crocker, live next week on the C-SPAN networks.
Now, we continue with the C-SPAN series, Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, from the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa, exploring the career of our 31st president.
On your screen is video of Herbert Hoover in South America, his trip down there. Richard Norton Smith, what was that trip?
As president-elect, he wanted to demonstrate to the Latin American community that he was going to be a different kind of president. He wasn't going to send Marines in at the drop of a hat. He invented something called the Good Neighbor Policy, which we, of course, identify with his successor, Franklin Roosevelt. But it does illustrate, again, the kind of activist president that Hoover wanted to be. Disarmament, as we've already heard, was a cause very close to his heart.
How old was he when he was president?
Well, he was 54 when he was elected. And
the years he served again?
1929 to 1933.
We're in our second hour of this 2-hour of our first program on the 12-part series on Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered. What are we going to see for the rest of the hour?
Well, the 1932 campaign obviously unfolded in a very, very different climate, probably symbolized by nothing more than what has become known as the Bonus Army. In the spring of 1932, some 60,000 World War I veterans who were demanding an advance on a bonus that was due to be paid to them in 1945 descended on Washington, petitioned Congress and the President. The Senate rejected them, 62 to 18, wasn't close. Fact is, 25% of the federal budget at that point was already being paid in veterans' benefits. Hoover quietly saw to it that they could go home free of charge on the rails. About 10,000 remained. Eventually there was a clash with the local police. The local authorities asked for federal help. Hoover agreed. Douglas MacArthur put on his uniform and his ribbons and basically overrode some of the president's instructions. The rest was a political disaster. FDR, on hearing the news, said, "This elects me." And he was right.
Tim Walsh, what do you have for us? You're the director of the library. You're out there with the archives, as we can see the library on the screen. Go ahead.
You bet. We're here in the reading room, and I want to read a letter. We've talked earlier about how difficult it is to get inside Herbert Hoover and to sense what he was feeling. And this is a letter from Lou to their sons, Herbert Jr. and Alan. And this is dated July of 32. And if we can get a close-up of the letter, we can see that it's got all kinds of amendments on it and changes, because she really wanted to be very careful with what she said to her sons. And she was talking about the burdens in his life, and she was talking particularly about World War I. I want to read just one paragraph. Those years of his life and ours, he gave up to the cause of the little man, millions of him. And not only those years, but most of the kind of happiness, of pleasure that has been his before. A certain definite and very original kind of joy of life was stamped out of him by those war years. Can you remember that as a fun-loving, fun-enjoying person, he completely changed? Not that he became altogether solemn and serious, not that a quaint whimsicality does not persist and is highly entertaining, but the old sparkling spontaneity is now only occasionally glimpsed far below the surface. For Herbert Hoover, the Depression was yet another great disaster, and one that burdened his soul. There's no question about it. It was a very difficult 4-year period. And so the election of 1932, as Richard mentioned, with the bonus march, and then the campaign itself against Franklin Roosevelt, who was a remarkable campaigner, was just difficult at best for Herbert Hoover.
Later on in this hour, we'll have another 15 minutes of calls for you. But right at the moment, we have some more video from the 32 campaign. What is it?
Well, we're going to look, among other things, at the contrast between Hoover and mass communications and the magical command of the same exercised by his opponent, Franklin Roosevelt.
This is about, let's see if I can find on my sheet here, it's about 7 minutes, I think. Let's watch.
And now, through the magic of broadcasting, we are to take you swiftly almost to the Pacific Ocean. President Hoover now is speeding westward to his home in California, where he and Mrs. Hoover will cast their ballots tomorrow. But tonight, on the eve of Election Day, the special train has pulled up to the little station at Elko, Nevada. Radio connections were quickly made. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
My fellow citizens, we have been through an arduous campaign. I hope from these discussions that the people will realize the great crisis that we have successfully passed and the unprecedented measures taken which have been designed solely that we might protect and restore the system of life and of government endeared to us over 150 years.
In a few minutes, the presidential special train will leave Elko, Nevada, and once again speed westward. The president's speech tonight closed the Republican presidential campaign and climaxed one of the most intensive campaigns ever undertaken by a chief executive of the United States.
1928 had been virtually a royal progress toward the White House. Not so 1932. Hoover fought the campaign alone. His original intent was to stay above the battle, maybe make 2 or 3 radio addresses, but in fact, he was too emotionally engaged. His reputation was on the line.
No man with a spark of humanity can sit in my place and without suffering from the picture of their anxieties and hardships before him day and night. They would be more than human if they were not led to blame their condition upon the government in power. I have understood their sufferings and have worked to the limits of my strength to produce action that would be of help to them.
This is Hoover trying to be a hail fellow well met when Republican leaders went through the motions of rallying to his support.
And we've had a wonderful time, and I'm able to make a splendid report as to our appreciation of what you've done in the White House, and we're going to keep you there.
Senator, I scarcely know whether to thank you for any such suggestion or not, but I do appreciate the character of the meeting which the party has had. It has shown a complete harmony to the American people.
In Detroit, there were riots. Light bulbs were thrown at the presidential train. Police found a bomb planted on the tracks in Nevada before the Hoover train arrived. Assassination was thought to be a very real possibility, so Secret Service agents stayed close to the president. Throughout, Hoover was on the defensive, even when, as here, he somewhat awkwardly tries to make light of it.
A circular placed in my hands since coming to this state, issued by the Democratic National Committee, says this depression was man-made. I agree with that. But they say the man who made it was myself personally.
Upon word of his nomination, Governor Roosevelt broke all precedents the way he has by flying to Chicago. The country was thrilled to this news.
That one gesture was so dramatic in 1932 that some of Hoover's advisors urged him to go up in the air with his friend Charles Lindbergh. And Hoover, of course, no public performer, thought that was ridiculous. You had the very instruments of mass communication which had raised Hoover to the pinnacle of American politics, now turned against him to make him, to this day, personally synonymous with one of the darkest chapters of the American story. The rules changed on Herbert Hoover. Hoover was unable to adapt. Franklin Roosevelt was a great improviser. And that's what people needed in 1932 and 1933. When people looked at Franklin Roosevelt, they saw a vigorous, confident man. They did not see a man in a wheelchair. Very few had any idea that he had any disability at all. Part of that was, in effect, a conspiracy of silence with journalists, but much more of it really, I think, was a result of FDR's own charisma. And a lot of it was he wasn't Herbert Hoover.
Greatest showman who ever stepped up to the plate, the actor who never disappoints, the one and only Babe Ruth, crashed out a Ruthian drive clear over the right field fence, much to the governor's delight.
Hoover doggedly struggled on, even when, in the middle of his last campaign speech, appropriately, his notestand collapses noisily in the middle of his radio appeal.
It is my deep conviction that for the welfare of the United States, the Republican Party should continue to administer the government. Those men and women who have supported the party over these many years should not be led astray by false gods arrayed in the rainbow colors of promises.
In November of 1932, Hoover carried only 6 states and less than 40% of the popular vote. His public persona as a master of emergencies had been obliterated, not so much by Franklin Roosevelt, but by the Great Depression itself, and by his own, above all, emotional and some might argue psychological shortcomings as an inspiring leader.
In this dedication of a nation, we humbly ask...
Few transitions have been more personally rocky or unpleasant than March 4th, 1933. Few could have imagined at that moment that Herbert Hoover would have a long, controversial, but ultimately distinguished post-White House career waiting for him. Here you see the outgoing president in top hat shaking his successor's hand on the inaugural stand and then turning and literally walking off the national stage. When Franklin Roosevelt said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, he spoke some of the most famous words of the 20th century. When Herbert Hoover, just a few days earlier in his final speech as president, also spoke of vanquishing fear, few people paid attention. The nation had turned a page long before then.
Ceaseless effort must be directed to the restoration of confidence, the vanquishing of fear and of apprehension, and thus the release of the recuperative spirit of the world.
Tim Walsh, director of the Herbert Hoover Library in West Branch, Iowa. What was his post-presidency like?
Well, it started out very difficult, and Brian, I have in my hand, I'm going to turn this around because folks should see this. This is a letter from an ordinary American named Sam Booth from Marion, Kentucky, written on March 2nd, 1933. So it was mailed before the end of the Hoover presidency, but it arrived after the Hoover presidency. And it's one of the so-called unfriendly letters that we do have in our file. As Richard suggested, the American people were bitter about those Hoover years. And I'm going to read just one paragraph from it to give you a sense of the flavor. This is from the first paragraph. President Hoover, as your time is drawing to a close, I'm writing to tell you how glad I am that your time in the White House has come to an end. I want to tell you that you are leaving the White House the most hated man that has ever occupied the White House. No, not the most hated man, the most hated wolf in sheep's clothing, a howling, prowling wolf, seeking whom he may devour. And for the next several years, the beginning of the years of wilderness, as Richard has sometimes called them, it was a difficult time. He was disliked, certainly, president reject. He had to rebuild a life for himself. As Richard earlier suggested, his relationship with Franklin Roosevelt was a part of that, always kind of hovering over Roosevelt, what Roosevelt was doing and how it related to Mr. Hoover. This other letter, and I want to point this one out too, goes back to 1920. It's a letter from Franklin Roosevelt to Hugh Gibson, who was then ambassador to Poland. Roosevelt was a Hoover admirer. And just like I read the unfriendly letter, let me read one paragraph from this letter, which is, again, January 2nd, 1920. I had some nice talks with Herbert Hoover, Franklin Roosevelt writes. Before he went west for Christmas, he certainly is a wonder, and I wish we could make him President of the United States. There could not be a better one. Those are the words of Franklin Roosevelt about Herbert Hoover. One can only wonder if Franklin Roosevelt had had his way and Hoover became candidate for president, how different history would have been. What redeemed Herbert Hoover, as Richard suggested earlier, was his relationship with Harry Truman. And this letter that I'm bringing forward is the letter that really starts it going. Franklin Roosevelt dies on April 12, 1945. This letter was written by Harry Truman on May 24th of 1945, inviting Herbert Hoover back to the White House, back to public life, as Representative Brown mentioned, back into the world that Mr. Hoover had known more than any other, which was public service. And let me just read this to you. This is again Harry Truman writing, "My dear Mr. President, if you should be in Washington, I would be most happy to talk over the European food situation with you. Also, it would be a pleasure for me to become acquainted with you. Most sincerely, Harry Truman." Mailed May 24th, 1945, Hoover was in the White House by May 28th, eager to help President Truman. Much, much later in life, and I only have the tissue because the original letter is in the Truman Library. This was a letter that Herbert Hoover wrote to Harry Truman. It said, "When you came to the White House, within a month you opened the door to me to the only profession I knew, public service, and you undid some disgraceful action that had been taken in the prior years. For all of this and your friendship, I am deeply grateful." This letter was so important to Harry Truman that he had it framed and placed on the credenza behind his desk at the Truman Library. That friendship of 20 years from 1946 to 1964 was an extraordinary one. Rich, full years for Herbert Hoover, all documented not only in our collections here, but go to the websites of the Truman Library or the Hoover website, look for Herbert Hoover and Harry S. Truman, a presidential partnership, and all will be revealed. It's just an extraordinary relationship.
Mr. Smith?
Yeah, he didn't say what the disgraceful thing was, but what he's referring to, among other things, is the renaming of Hoover Dam, Boulder Dam, something that occurred very early in the Roosevelt presidency and that President Truman undid early in his presidency. One other thing Harry Truman did, for which Herbert Hoover was eternally grateful, he hung Mrs. Hoover's portrait in the White House for the first time.
We've got an audio clip, it's very brief, about the famine relief. Can you tell us what that clip is all about?
Well, this is after World War II. Mr. Hoover is 71 years old, and Harry Truman asks him to the White House and sends him off to 38 countries in an unpressurized plane, unspeakable conditions, to beg, borrow, cajole enough food to avert worldwide famine.
Let's listen.
This tonight is my report to the American people upon the world famine situation. 3 weeks ago, I broadcasted from Cairo our report upon the situation in Europe. Since then, we have examined the food problems in Egypt, in Iraq, in India, and Siam, and the Philippines, China, Korea, and Japan. Thus, we have compassed most of Asia. At the request of President Truman, I have acted as a sort of a food ambassador to determine the need, to discover possible further sources of supplies, to coordinate the world's effort to master this the most gigantic danger to the lives of millions of people. Beyond this, it has been my duty to represent the solicitude of the American people and their desire to help. Along the 35,000 miles that we have traveled, I have seen with my own eyes the grimmest specter of famine in all the history of this world. Of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the one named war has gone, at least for a while. But famine and pestilence and death are still charging upon the earth.
About 35 minutes to go at the Hoover Library, and you're in the memorabilia section. And in just a moment, you're going to meet Maureen Harding, who has been at the Hoover Library for almost 30 years. She's a curator. And give us an idea, Maureen Harding, of what you're standing near.
I'm standing near a selection of artifacts. We have about 8,000 in this collection storage, which is a combination, about 85% historic artifacts, also supplies, exhibit crates, and as you can see, it's also a workstation. We've kind of set up a temporary area here to show you some of the artifacts, and we were talking about primarily the famine, and if people remember the clip that showed the ship coming across with the big Belgian relief banner on it, this is one of the results from that. They would take flour sacks, also sacks of corn and grain, and ship them through the German lines. They had to negotiate with the Germans because there was a barricade of the German submarines, and this particular sack is one of the most exquisite in our collection, of about 450. This used to be filled with flour. It's absolutely beautiful. It shows the Belgian rooster, which is the symbol of Belgium, very similar to the eagle in the United States. After the sacks were emptied, they'd be sent to schools where girls were trained to embroider and sew and make lace. And also they were sent to professional sewing workplaces where they would recycle the bags and turn them into clothing and accessories, because Belgium was getting nothing in at that point except for the food that Herbert Hoover was able to bring. And these were sent as gifts to Herbert Hoover and the Commission for Relief in Belgium members. And these members received, I think, $1 a year. In other words, this was entirely voluntary. Hoover was able to convince and persuade the mills in America to contribute the flour. Nobody was paid anything for this. America just shipped it over and saved the entire country of Belgium from starvation. And so the people were extremely thankful. We have hundreds and hundreds of gifts in our collection. Probably 50% at least of our 8,000 artifacts are gifts of appreciation and thanks to Herbert Hoover. One man can make a difference. At the time he was feeding Belgium, soon afterwards President Woodrow Wilson asked him to head the U.S. Food Administration. And that was kind of the early version of rationing. In other words, there were wheatless Mondays and meatless Wednesdays and lightless Thursdays, and the entire country voluntarily chose to follow Herbert Hoover as the U.S. Food Administrator. We have 2 paintings. We would like to point out, we have about 40 in our collection that were commissioned from artists all over the nation. They were never on display. They were commissioned to show the food situation, what people at home were doing, and why. This particular artist has painted in the soldiers over in Europe in the clouds. We also have a painting next to it that shows a fully laden table. Most of America was not starving at this time, but the soldiers needed their help. And so this was an art project that was going to be sent around the country, but unfortunately for the artist, but fortunately for the entire world, the World War I ended before this actually was sent around the country. After World War I, Herbert Hoover was still busy feeding the world. He was feeding Finland, he was feeding Russia, and we have a beautiful scroll. This is on silk, it's parchment on silk and decorated and defined with colored inks. It is kind of falling apart, and this was a scroll that was sent by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic to Herbert Hoover, and particularly to thank him for food relief and promising him that the Soviets would never, ever forget what America had done for them. He chose to put this in a place of honor in all of his homes ever since then. In fact, there's a story, and I believe it came from our former director, Richard Norton Smith. Hi, Richard. That I lost my train of thought.
You're telling a story that came.
The story, yes, that Herbert Hoover was asked in the 1950s for the return of this scroll. They wanted it back, and Herbert Hoover refused.
What is that behind you? Because we're running out of time. What are the porcelain work or?
Oh, the porcelains. They started, the Hoovers, Mr. and Mrs. Hoover both, started collecting Chinese porcelains from the time they were in China in 1900 all the way up through the 1960s. At one time, they had probably 400 of these Chinese porcelains from the Qing dynasty. Most of what they collected was what they called the blue and whites. And this was from the Kangxi period. It was about mid-1600s to the early 1700s. They are supposedly priceless. There would be a price on them on the market, of course. People have asked, what are they worth? I would say if you had one of these, you would not have to worry about paying your bills. You could probably send all of your children to college and your retirement would be taken care of as well. Now, these were collected in particular by the Hoovers because they were the highest quality, the finest quality. We have the bluest blues, the finest quality porcelain, and also the finest detail in the landscape paintings and in the symbolic decorative motifs. We do have one over here, Bill, if you can catch this one, This looks a little more crude, a little rougher, and this comes from the Ming Dynasty, which is actually older than the Qing Dynasty, but it is not worth as much as one of the other porcelains from the Kangxi period. Now, it's a little bit crude. Yes?
We're going to have to, we're running out of time. We'll come back to you during calls if it's okay. Can you?
Sure.
Yeah, we need to get to some more video, and then we'll be back to you when we take some calls from the audience, which is being in about 10 minutes or so. Set us up on the next clip, which is not too long, about the 1956 GOP convention.
Well, by 1956, of course, a lot had changed. There was a Republican in the White House for the first time in 20 years, Dwight Eisenhower. Ironically, Hoover probably had a better relationship, personally and politically, with Harry Truman than he did with his fellow Republican, Dwight Eisenhower. But every 4 years, it would become, like the great opera singer who made periodic farewell tours. Every 4 years, Herbert Hoover would show up at the Republican convention, receive a great ovation, and let people know he was still around.
This is where?
This is in San Francisco.
And it's less than 3 minutes. We'll be right back.
The date, Tuesday, August 21st, second day of the centennial meeting of the Republican Party. And former President Herbert Hoover is being escorted to the podium.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the Republican Convention, and my fellow Americans, I am proud of your welcome. For me to meet at the stand and in my escort so many of my old friends, they have stood up loyally for me through thick and thin, and some of those years where they stood up were pretty thin. In our generation, we have seen mankind's hope of freedom threatened and even overwhelmed by the revival of old ideas and the spread of a host of new ideas dangerous to free men. Among them, of course, are the ideas of communism, of fascism, and atheism, and aggressive nationalism, and that veiled sister of communism, legalistic socialism. You are here to feed the reviving fires of spiritual fervor, which once stirred Americans to live and to die for human liberty. You are not less able or courageous than they were. Now, my friends, I've lived a long life. I have witnessed and even taken part in many great and threatening crises. With each time that they have been surmounted, the American dream has become more real. And my faith in the future arises from the genius of our people, their devotion to personal liberty, their sustaining religious beliefs. And with the deepest sincerity, may I say, God bless you. Thank you.
Tim Waltz from the Herbert Hoover Library in West Branch, Iowa. What age was Herbert Hoover when he died?
He was 90 years, just past his 90th birthday, died on October 20th, 1964.
Did he live at this time in 56? Was he living at the Waldorf Astoria?
He was living at the Waldorf Astoria. By this time, he had moved into Suite 31A. Of course, he was the 31st president. He had lived in a different suite, I understand, when Mrs. Hoover was alive. She had died in January of 1944. But basically, after 44, Mr. Hoover stayed pretty much in New York, except for his annual visits out to California for the Bohemian Grove encampment, and he would spend a week fishing up in Oregon or in Northern California.
What new little goodies do you have in your hand?
What I've got in my hand is a book that is familiar to some people. It's Profiles in Courage. I'm just going to show you the spine and then open this up to show it to you, because as everyone knows, Profiles in Courage was written by John F. Kennedy, but what they don't realize is that there was a friendship between the Kennedy family and the Hoovers that actually started with the president's father, Joseph Kennedy, Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, who was an isolationist before World War II, meaning he was opposed to our entry into the war, as was Herbert Hoover, and they became friends and actually worked together. Joseph Kennedy was on the Hoover Commission, and what this says in President Kennedy's difficult-to-read handwriting to the President of the United States, to President Herbert Hoover, with the admiration and highest regard of the author John F. Kennedy. And we have quite an assortment of documents in our collection related to John F. Kennedy. I want to read one very poignant card. This tiny little card was written by Jacqueline Kennedy on February 16th, 1964, acknowledging a lunch that she and the children had had with President Hoover on Valentine's Day. And remember that date, February 16th, 1964. This is the Valentine's Day following the assassination of President Kennedy. They were deep friends. In 1998, Eunice Shriver came here, and I asked her why was it so important for her to come to the Hoover Presidential Library, and she said, "My father told me that Herbert Hoover was the most intelligent man he ever met." So the Hoovers and the Kennedys go back a long way, and we have lots of documentation that underscores that point.
Richard Norton Smith, 1960.
Extraordinary behind-the-scenes story. Election night 1960, everyone knows it was an incredibly close election. There were Republicans that night and thereafter who wanted to contest the election, particularly in Illinois and Texas. Well, Joe Kennedy, Ambassador Kennedy, who had worked with Mr. Hoover on the Hoover Commissions, and they'd become very close friends, called his friend, Mr. Hoover, and asked for a favor. And one thing led to another, and in fact, Hoover contacted Richard Nixon and arranged, behind the scenes, for Nixon to engage in a very public handshake with John F. Kennedy, which in effect publicly put an end to any possibility that the election would be contested. People did not know it at the time, but it was two old men, Joe Kennedy and Herbert Hoover, unlikely friends and allies, who prevented what we saw in 2000.
We're going to go back to the phones right after this video clip, which is only about 2 minutes and a half. And it's Charles Collingwood.
That's right. This is person to person. In addition, Hoover loved to fish. To the end of his life, he used to go down every winter to the Florida Keys. And here you see Herbert Hoover at last comfortable in front of a television camera.
This gentleman is the former President of the United States, Herbert Hoover. We'll call on him at his winter home, the Key Largo Anglers Club in Florida. I'm Charles Collingwood. The name of the program is Person to Person. Herbert Hoover spends part of the winter each year living and working here in this cottage at the Key Largo Anglers Club in Florida. Here he enjoys his favorite pastime, the fine art of fishing. And when that small flag, the one in the middle, is flying, the presidential flag, it means that Mr. Hoover, the honorary Commodore of the club, is present.
Mr. Collingwood, we're surely glad to have you visit Florida because you brought a grand, sunshiny day. There have been presidents like Grover Cleveland and myself who've been fishermen from boyhood. We got the habit. But there are other reasons. One of them is that there are 35 million Americans that take out a fishing license each year, and they are a great potential for candidates.
May we see the Hoover Winter Workshop, Mr. President? Could we see where you do your work here?
Yes, sir, I'd be delighted.
Now, Mr. Hoover, it's fairly common knowledge, I think, that you never accepted any compensation for your public service.
I did so because I had my schooling, my professional training at the hands of the American people. It had enabled me to accumulate a modest competence, and I felt the least I could do was to return to them indirectly any pay that I got from public office.
Do you agree with those who say that former presidents ought to be given a seat in the Senate, Mr. Hoover?
Mr. Collingwood, 20 years ago, I would have been enthusiastic about that. But at my time of life, I don't look on the prospect of sitting on a hard cushion for several hours a day and listening to speeches as being very attractive.
But you think that in principle it's a good idea?
I think it ought to be done. The president, former president, can provide a great deal of experience, more especially to the committees of Congress.
Charles Collingwood, who is a longtime CBS reporter's niece, Eloise Collingwood, works for this network and has for many years as one of our morning show producers. I had to mention that, Richard.
Great.
Let's take some calls. Warwick, New York, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hello there. As a young newspaper reporter back in the 1960s, I got to interview Hoover at his apartment in the Waldorf Astoria. It was a very rare thing that Miss Bernice Miller told me that he didn't do that very often with people. And I asked him about Roosevelt and his relationship in view of the Kennedy-Eisenhower transition that had just was taking place. And he said, that's a very bad question. But he said, Mr. Roosevelt did what he wanted to do, and that's all I'm going to say about it. This was, 1961, after he had, almost 30 years later. He also became a very good friend of Jim Farley, who lived in the Waldorf Towers apartment. And Farley told me that he admired Hoover, and he said the Democrats had treated Hoover very badly. And that's a very interesting friendship they had. But it was very good. He gave me a break as a young reporter to interview him when the big papers in New York City, he would not allow them to talk to him.
Thanks. Mr. Smith.
Well, it is true, as I said, that he often got along better with Democratic presidents, people like Harry Truman, Woodrow Wilson, John Kennedy, than he did with his Republican counterparts.
Let's go to Greenville, Mississippi. You're on the air. Greenville, please turn down your, let's see, do we have, no, we've got, I apologize, we have Washington, D.C. You're on the air.
Hello, Brian Lamb.
Hi.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
Question. Are there any documents in the archive about Hoover's view on Roosevelt and what he thought about him? Was he scared about him or anything about that?
Tim Walsh.
Well, yes. In fact, we have a sizable collection that we draw from not only our own materials here, but also from the Roosevelt Library that documents the relationship between Herbert Hoover and Franklin D. Roosevelt. In fact, we published a book several years ago of edited documents that basically about the two men and their kind of entangled relationship. But as the caller suggests, it's a troubled relationship. It goes back to the Wilson administration when they're colleagues, traces its way through a time when Franklin Roosevelt was head of the American Construction Council and Herbert Hoover was Secretary of Commerce. They together, by the way, were the ones who came up with the standards for the 2x4. And then on to Roosevelt's role as governor of New York and the relationship to the Great Depression when Hoover's president, political rivals, and then really bitter enemies after that. So it's a troubled, tumultuous relationship, fascinating on many different angles. And as Richard suggested, there's the issue of Boulder Dam versus Hoover Dam and how Harry Truman rectified that terrible injustice.
St. Augustine, Florida. Go ahead, please. I'm sorry. Greenville, Mississippi. I'm reading the wrong line. Greenville, you're now on the air.
Okay. My question is, in the 1927 flood, there was a camp here in Greenville, and one of the things that they did was to make Mississippi flood quilts and send them to the north to sell to raise money. And this was part of Hoover's plan to not only make money, but also to generate activity. I wonder if anybody at the library would have evidence of, or even have one of those Mississippi flood quilts.
Maureen Harding, can you help us with this?
We don't have one, and I've never even heard of it. It's the first I've heard of it. I'll try to find out what I can find out.
Got to ask you about that
Maybe
dress.
in one of the Southern museums.
That dress you're standing next to, what is it?
This is Mrs. Hoover's favorite White House reception dress. Now, this was in 1927 and 1928, so she was not actually First Lady at this time. It's white chiffon and with gold glass beading. She would have been, I guess you would call it, Mrs. Secretary of Commerce at that time, invited to the receptions and parties at the White House. I do believe it would fit me very nicely. Next to that, we have a staff favorite, And this over here, Bill, is what we call the doodle dress. This is a dress that was made based on patterns of Hoover doodles. He had doodled throughout the meetings that he would have, always listening, of course, but he came up with incredibly geometric designs that was turned into a pattern for a dress and worn by Peggy Hoover, who was a very young girl at the time. As grandchildren, she and her brother, Pete, lived in the White House with Mr. and Mrs. Hoover.
St. Augustine, Florida now. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Lamb.
Yes.
I have a question. I've asked this question of dozens of people, and very few, maybe one person got this right. And this is the question. Who was the first American president that was born west of the Mississippi?
Mr. Smith.
Herbert Hoover.
Is he right?
No one ever gets this right. Now, I'd like to ask the historian, why doesn't anyone get this right?
Oh boy, you know, we don't have all night, sir. There are a lot of things that people don't get right about presidents, including this one. But keep on asking.
Hillsborough, New Jersey. Go ahead, please.
Well, I learned of Mr. Hoover's greatness early on, and how this, you know, this sort of very trite comment about him all the time as a failed president mischaracterizes the man. When I read of how he fed the Germans at the end of the blockade in World War I, and I just would like to hear more comment on that. And also, I want to mention a book I picked up years ago. It's in my collection, called Herbert Hoover on Growing Up, His Letters from and to American Children. And it's one of the most charming and evocative little reads you could get. His personality really comes through in it.
Tim Walsh.
Yes, absolutely. As far as food relief was concerned, Herbert Hoover didn't believe in national boundaries. He fed, as the film, a famous film of that time, he fed our enemies. Basically, Herbert Hoover felt that food should be used to help to bring the world to peace. In fact, it's a quote we have on our floor. That wonderful little book he mentioned, the caller mentioned, on Growing Up, is one of two books that stayed in print for a long time. The other is Fishing for Fun. And those two rather whimsical books, a book of letters from children and a book about fishing, are in many ways the more popular books about Herbert Hoover and enjoyed literally by millions. So hold on to that book. It certainly evokes the sort of the whimsical side of Herbert Hoover.
This program and 11 others are provided as a look at history through the National Archives and Records Administration, and the big help of Alan Weinstein through all this period. And we appreciate everything that the archives have done to help us, and the archives.
And also the Office of Presidential Libraries, which is headed up by Sharon Fawcett. They have all been extraordinarily helpful in this enormous scavenger hunt that we've been conducting for the last year.
Shiner, Texas, you're on the air.
Yes, I had a question as to why it's Herbert Hoover is his birth name not being actually Hoover, and all. Why is that such a little known fact?
Maureen Harding, do you happen to know the answer to that?
Why is, excuse me, I didn't catch the question.
Question was that Hoover is not his birth name. Is that right, Richard Norton?
No, that's his name.
That's his name?
He did drop
No, I agree, it's his name.
He dropped his middle initial. Remember, he was an engineer. And he asked his son, who was his namesake, Herbert C. Hoover, he said, would you be willing to drop your middle initial too? And he said, why? He said, because I have to sign my name so many times a day that I've calculated that if I don't have to sign my middle initial, I can save whatever it was, 5 minutes. It gives you an idea of how he thought.
Hartford, Wisconsin, good evening.
Hi, good evening. I admit to lack of knowledge of Hoover, except I did visit his dam in '74. I'm really, really impressed with his speaking ability, and I was wondering, you know, where is his background? Where did he learn to speak? Was it a college thing, or I'm just really impressed the way he's able to, you know, put out his information.
Tim Walsh.
Yeah, it's something of a classical education at Stanford University. It's interesting that the caller obviously was impressed by Hoover's ability to speak in public, because Mr. Hoover had sort of a flat, sort of a monotone, certainly by comparison with Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, one of the challenges that Hoover faced in speaking to people through a radio microphone was that he compared it to talking to a bathroom doorknob. He liked to make eye contact. He liked to build on the relationship, the one-on-one, the powerful relationship that he could make in expressing a cause or a point of view. And when he had to talk into a microphone, it just didn't have that power, whereas Franklin Roosevelt could use the microphone almost as an extension of himself. So interestingly enough, some people find Herbert Hoover's voice flat and too much of a monotone, but we've come to love and appreciate it here in West Branch.
Maureen Harding is a curator at the library. Do you have anything else to show us up there in the memorabilia room?
Oh, we have quite a bit. I'll just keep talking until you tell me to shut up. We have a Hoover ball. Hoover would play the special game that was part tennis and part volleyball on the grounds of the White House every single morning. Some of the cabinet members, sometimes Supreme Court members, would play with him, 7 o'clock every morning. We have the very first telephone that was ever in the Oval Office, and it's labeled extension 30. So there must have been at least 30 different extensions at that time. Next to it we have some fishing equipment. It's a deep sea fishing reel and a variety of fishing poles, a fishing tie. We only have 2 items of clothing of Herbert Hoover's in our entire collection. One is a fishing tie and one is a fishing hat. We also have a few other gifts of thanks from Germany. The accordion children's drawings explain the whole process of getting food to Germany and to the schools, and every day they would have their German lunch.
Let me grab a call here and remind our audience that all these programs have been produced and will be produced by Mark Farkas, our top history producer here at C-SPAN. Go to New Orleans, Louisiana. You're on the air.
Hello.
Go ahead, please.
Good evening to both of you gentlemen. I'm researching the life of Walter L. Cohen, the most influential African-American politician in my state, Louisiana, from about 1900 to 1930. And in his different appointments as registrar of the land office here and as comptroller of customs, he dealt very closely with all of the presidents, particularly the Republican presidents, including President Hoover. And there are a lot of quotes from conversations he had with President Hoover at the White House and correspondence. And I was wondering, what would Mr. Smith recommend as the most important source for presidential appointments, particularly to black people in that era by President Hoover?
Well, it's interesting you say that because Hoover's come in for a good deal of criticism for actually almost having an early version of the so-called Southern strategy. Something quite remarkable happened at the Hoover White House. Mrs. Hoover took a lot of heat because she invited, it's hard to believe, this is the first time, 1929, first time in history that a black woman had been socially welcomed at the White House. Turned out she was the wife of Oscar DePriest, who was a black congressman from Chicago. And it was a great controversy. The Texas legislature actually voted to impeach the president. Other people had accused the First Lady of defiling the White House. And Mrs. Hoover apologized to her husband, not for the act of inviting Mrs. DePriest, but for the difficulties that it had created for him. And Hoover had a great comeback. He said, "Don't worry, Lou, you did the right thing. And one of the consolations of Orthodox religion is that it provides a hot hell for the Texas legislature."
By the way, the 2 cameras that we have that were operating those close shots out there in the West Branch tonight were operated by Bill Heffley and Lynn Woodmore. You had another quick
Well, I was just going to say, I would ask Tim. Tim, could you recommend a particular volume or good source work for this questioner in terms of Hoover and racial politics in the 20s and 30s?
I can't actually remember the exact title, but it's by Don Lisio, L-I-S-I-O, on Hoover's strategy toward African Americans. And I certainly would recommend that the caller contact us through our website because I'm sure we have documentation related to African Americans in Louisiana and that particular, I can't speak to that particular individual, but we'll do our very best to locate the information they're looking for.
Just about 4 minutes left till we show you our last video for this first in a series of 12 programs on presidential libraries. St. Louis, Missouri, you're on the air.
In her book about First Ladies, Margaret Truman's chapter on Lou Hoover, the title was something on the lines of Death by Newsprint, the thrust being that the press coverage of Herbert contributed to Lou's fatal heart attack. Is that a valid analysis?
I don't think so. I think in a sense, though, there's no doubt that Lou Henry Hoover would have been a very different kind of first lady if if her husband's presidency hadn't been run over by the Great Depression. She was very much an activist, very much in the mold of Eleanor Roosevelt. But of course, once the Great Depression really took over and redefined the Hoover presidency, she defined her chief business as trying to minister to his needs. And as a result, it was almost as if she took the veil. And I've always thought it's one of the tragedies of the Hoover presidency.
Kernersville, North Carolina. Last call. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Lamb and Mr. Smith, good evening. I've enjoyed your program quite a bit. My question is, Mr. Smith, do you have any information about the school that Lou Hoover started up at Camp Rapidan for the children in the Appalachian Mountains? She had selected a teacher from Berea, Kentucky by the name of Christine Vest, who is my grandmother.
Really?
And I was wondering if you had any information on that school that was started by Lou Hoover.
Well, it's interesting. The Hoovers might be unpopular in other parts of the country, but they were very popular there in and around the fishing camp. You're absolutely right. They discovered one day, I think a small child actually wandered into the camp, and they realized they did not have a modern school. And so, characteristically, without a lot of publicity, they paid for the construction of a school. They hired a teacher, as you mentioned. First of all, I hope you will contact the library in West Branch, because I know they would love to talk to you about that relationship.
Final comments, Tim Walsh.
Yes, there's a wonderful book that the caller needs to get called Ghost Girl by Delia Ray, who did research here at the Hoover Library on that school. It's fiction, but it's for young adults. It's a brilliant book based on solid research about the Rapidan School. Ghost Girl by Delia Ray.
Tim Walsh, thank you very much, as always. It's fun being with you again. And to Maureen Harding, thank you for your work this evening, along with Matt Schaefer, who was on in our first hour. And must tell you that part of our team, Mark Farkas's team, Rick Stoddard, Eric Nelson, and Delia Rios, and many others participated in making this evening happen. And we're going to close it out with a clip of basically the announcement of the opening of the Hoover Library.
That's right. This very unlikely friendship, Harry Truman and Herbert Hoover, who come on Mr. Hoover's 88th birthday, and they are here to open the Hoover Library, which Harry Truman said was so small it would fit in the basement of his.
Next week, it's the FDR Library. Let's look at the final clip.
You don't know how very much I appreciate the privilege of being invited to come here and take part in the opening of this great library of President Herbert Hoover. I think the world and all of him. As I said before, he did a job for me that nobody else in the world could have done. He kept millions of people from starving to death after the Second World War, just as he did after the First World War for Woodrow Wilson. I've always been fond of him. I feel that I'm one of his closest friends, and he's one of my closest friends, and that's the reason I'm here. I'm here because I like him. I'm here because I think he's doing the right thing in turning his documents over to the public here in this library, and I'm as happy as I can be to be a part of the organization that's here celebrating the birthday of one of America's greatest men. And I speak advisedly because I know most of them, and he's one of them.
I have listened for the last few moments with interest, and it would take too much of your time if I tried to explain the overstatements that have been made. And I may settle all this for you by saying I think they're all true. In these records there are, no doubt, many unfavorable remarks made by our political opponents, as well as the expressions of appreciation and affection by our friends. We may hope that future students will rely upon our friends for consultation. I was taken from this village to the far west 78 years ago. The only material assets which I had were 2 dimes in my pocket, the suit of clothes that I wore, and I had some extra underpinnings provided by loving aunts. But I carried from here something much more precious. I carried with me recollections of a joyous childhood, and I carried with me the family disciplines of hard work. That included picking potato bugs at 10 cents a hundred. Now, incidentally, that money was used for the serious purpose of buying firecrackers to applaud the founding fathers on each 4th of July.
Now, the C-SPAN series Presidential Libraries. Now, the C-SPAN series Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, visits the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa, and explores the career of our 31st president.
On April 7, 1927, the telephone was 51 years old. In a New York auditorium, a handful of people were given a glimpse of the future. It was called television. The show, if you could call it that, originated in Washington, D.C. and starred Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce. This first crude transmission was the work of engineers from Bell Laboratories. They had invented the transmission system not for the sake of entertainment, but to learn more about long-distance networks. At the time, few people realized just how successful the experiment would turn out to be.
What's your 1932 campaign? American Political Archive will air Herbert Hoover's campaign speeches from 1932. It's also heard on XM Satellite Radio, Channel 132. That's tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio. For more historical